Now we all have to hit got it. Is it my turn?
It is your turn.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Birdsong. I'm chairman of the programs committee, and I'm here to introduce Todd Pover, who is a senior wildlife biologist for Conserve Wildlife Foundation of New Jersey. He has been involved in the research and management of beach nesting birds in New Jersey and other portions of the Atlantic Flyway for almost 30 years. He is a graduate of Rutgers University. And just like me, he loves piping plovers. And of course, he's just one little L short of being a plover himself. Everybody, here's Todd Povert.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And it's good to be here this evening. I will have to apologize. I realized my neighbor decided to cut their lawn now in the evening. So hopefully it won't be too loud. So yeah, tonight I'm going to talk to you about a habitat restoration that I helped oversee in Barnegat Light, New Jersey. And I'm sure coastal New Jersey seems far away to you, but remember, we are actually only one state away, quite a few hours from you. And so to start, I want to point out the restoration at Barnegat Light. The focal species were, as Mary said, piping plover. And then we had American oystercatcher in mind, black skimmers, and least terns. In New Jersey, the piping plover, black skimmer, and least terns are all state endangered. The oystercatcher is considered a species of special concern. And of course, the plover is federally listed. It's a little bit different than your Great Lakes population. Our Atlantic population is actually threatened, not endangered. But in any case, in New Jersey, at least, one of the limiting factors for all these species is available habitat. And so that's one of the was the main objective, to create more habitat for them. So, I mean, this is, I don't know how many of you have actually ever been to the Jersey Shore or New Jersey coast, but this is what it looks like. Upper right-hand corner, you have rides almost right on the beach. That big empty spot, they have race cars on the beach in the summer. You can see how developed the barrier islands are. And then the bottom, that one has a boardwalk at the back. So not the most natural sites. We do have some natural sites, but this is really a typical Jersey Shore beach. Huh. After all that, now it's not advancing. So how did that happen? Oh, there we go. Apologies for that. So the other thing I wanted to point out is the New Jersey beaches are also very crowded. There's nobody in this particular picture, but as you can see, the area outside of our fence where we fenced off for nesting birds, everything but where it was fenced is trampled. Many of our other beaches are cleaned and raked with these machines. And so they're almost like groomed lawns, not natural habitat sites. I'm just going to check, Mary or somebody, could you just give me a thumbs up that everybody can hear okay? Because I had a little mini glitch with my computer just now.
Todd, I can hear you real well.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, as far as on the Atlantic coast, and in particular, the mid-Atlantic and beaches south where plovers nest, so down to the Carolinas, this is what the kind of habitat they would prefer. This is New Jersey, so this is one of our few natural beaches. And that beach you see, that sandy area, is what we call a overwash fan. So there would have been a dune line in the middle of the beach, and then storms pushed the sand back into the marsh. And this is the most highly preferred habitat for our piping plovers. There's a few reasons why, but one of the main ones is it provides access to the back shore where they can get low energy 24/7 feeding, especially for the chicks, rather than only having the option of going to the ocean front at low tide to feed. So this is highly desirable. Another similar idea is a natural inlet. It has the same type of features as the one I just showed you. And again, unfortunately, in New Jersey, we have very little of this natural habitat and highly suitable habitat for piping plovers. Okay, I know all these presentations have to have a map of where we're located, and I just couldn't make myself do a formal map. So all I'm just want to show you here is if you are interested and you want to look up later, Barnegat Light is Central Coast. There's a little lighthouse icon right about in the middle of the coast. By New Jersey parlance, we go by our Turnpike and Garden State Parkway exits. It's at 63, and we have about 127 miles of Atlantic coast, so it's almost dead center in the middle there. Now, these kind of photos are probably more fun if you're really familiar with the site, but I want to show you a little bit of progression going back in history. So this is back in 1977. The lighthouse would be at the top of the beach there. You can't quite see it on there, but one thing that's important on the lower beach there, there's no jetty or anything. It's a natural beach. And at the tip there, there's some water. And then over the course of another less than 10 years, this spit formed. And at the time, and I'll get into this a little bit more, there was about a dozen pair of piping plovers here on this spit and a little bit further down. And then between about here, Barnegat Light is one of the most, there's been a lot of shipwrecks here, you know, if you read the historical record, and just in general, in order to keep the inlet open for recreational purposes, the Army Corps of Engineers decided that they were going to build a massive jetty here. They were having to dredge every year frequently. And so this is a little bit after that photo. And I'm sorry, some of these pictures are a little grainy, but these are coming from the archives. When I was developing ideas for the site, I went back pretty far back and found these. So now you can see that there's a jetty on, it's kind of a straight open inlet, and that jetty extends really pretty far from the lighthouse at the top left. Interestingly, in general, I mentioned already that jetties are not highly suitable for plovers, but in this case, it created, as the sand started to accrete and against the jetty, it created a really wide beach, and you can even see up by the lighthouse to the right, there's a few ponds on the beach, ephemeral pools and ponds. And so at that time, at least, it was, the plovers actually responded to it, and we're still using the site quite frequently. And we had large skimmer and black skimmer, common tern, least terns. So this was one of the most important sites back in the late 80s and early 90s in all of New Jersey for our endangered beach nesting birds. And then scrolling really not too far, about 5 years ago, this is what the site looked like as we were beginning to want to restore it. And so the main reason, you can see in the previous picture, and I'm going to scroll back real quick, all that empty sand. And if you don't know, at least on the Atlantic coast, our plovers primarily like open, sparsely vegetated beaches. They don't like dense dunes. And a lot of the green and brown you see up by the inlet now is actually, it was a massive maritime forest, which, just as a little side note, is also a highly valuable habitat and not one we have a lot in New Jersey. But the idea was, this was one of the few spots in New Jersey where we had enough land in the right ownership with a partner that we could do a large scale restoration for plovers. And we did have to sacrifice that maritime forest, but in the end, we were only able to get the permit if we could do a 2-to-1 recreation of a maritime forest somewhere. And originally, they wanted us to do it at the site, which totally didn't make any sense since we had to get rid of it at the site. So we were fortunately able to partner with the National Park Service about 60 miles north at Sandy Hook Gateway National Recreation Area. They were looking to actually start growing a maritime forest. So we planted up there as part of the project. So anyhow, the point here is you can see that it's much more densely vegetated. There's not a lot of open sand. And by about this time, we only had 1 or 2 pair of plovers left at the site. There just was not suitable habitat remaining. So a lot of words on here. I'll try to just hit the, this is some of the stuff I was just mentioning. I wanted to give you just an idea of the numbers. I had mentioned that we had about 12 pairs of plovers back in the 80s and 90s. We were down to 3 in 2018 and only 1 left at that inlet. There is another part of the beach a couple miles south that's still part of the municipality that had some plovers as well. And we had, our recovery target was 8 to 12 pairs of plovers. So with only 1 left, we were way off. And back in the early to mid 90s, we had a peak of 650 lease turns. We were averaging about 400 lease turns a year for 1 period. And after that, the most we had was just 34 adults and had none since 2011. So in the last decade or so, we had no lease turns remaining at the site. Black skimmers, going back to that same early 1990, the mid 90s, when you saw that nice open beach. We didn't have quite as many skimmers, but our skimmer population is relatively modest in New Jersey. So we had on average about 10 to 15 or 20% of the population was at this site. And none, but we've had none there since 1996. So you can see it was once a pretty important area, and really when we started thinking about this, I say when we started thinking about this, I've been thinking about this for decades, or a decade and a half, but it was taking us a long time to really get people to take us seriously about this. And so about 2016 or so, it started to look like we might actually be able to pull this restoration off. Oh gosh. I apologize again. I just have to plug in my computer. That should be better. Okay. So just one more picture of the site. This was 2018 and 19, the winter immediately prior to when we were going to start the construction. And this just, you can really see how vegetated it is in this picture. It was a little closer than that aerial. So if anyone knows piping plover habitat, you can see there's virtually none there. That area close that you see open was actually a construction site unrelated to our project. Okay, so I told you I was thinking about this project for a long time, and like many good things, this actually, the idea was drawn on a cocktail napkin, and this is the napkin. My idea was to create what I call the Plover Pond in the beach to kind of mimic those ponds that were on the beach 20 some years ago when they first built the jetty and the plovers liked, and just open it back up. We were going to leave some of the dunes in place, but create a lot of really simple, really simple idea in theory. And of course, when we started working on the permit and talking to our partners, they weren't going to accept this cocktail napkin as our our concept. So of course we did convert that to fancy plans. And I'm not going to get into the details of that. We're going to stick to the interesting part. But one thing we knew, we were going to create that Plover Pond, and we weren't sure how. Originally, I'm going to go back actually to the napkin. Originally, I was thinking of building some kind of structure under the jetty so that it could be a tidally flowed pond, which would be most ideal and mimic how a tidal flat would work for piping plovers. But the Army Corps of Engineers, and I'm not, I realize why I wasn't too thrilled about us trying to build some kind of pipes under their jetty and undermining it. And so that never was going to happen for if we wanted to get a permit. So we had to go back to the drawing board. And so this is my main partner on the project in the upper left, on the right, one of our techs, and then the woman that has the blonde hair on the right, that's Dr. Brooke Maslow from Rutgers University. Her and I have done some research together, and some of that was what typical plover habitat would be. And this, in addition to this being like a dream come true for me, the whole idea of creating this habitat project, it was a way of testing some of our research as well, as far as what density of vegetation, how much shell cover, the pools and the foraging component. And so it was really exciting on a number of levels. And so, but one of the things I mentioned, the pond, because we couldn't tidally fill it, we had to come up with another idea. So the first thing we did is run these test wells all along the beach to try to figure out where the water table was. And we tested it on a high tide, a low tide, full moon, new moon, just to get an idea of where that sweet spot would be if we were going to dig a pond here, where it might stay filled. And of course, there was a lot of other factors we can't control: rain, precipitation, particular heat if it dries out. But to be honest, what we were really looking for anyhow, we didn't want a deep pond. We were really worried about, we wanted it to be shallow and just moist substrate. So as much as we were doing with science, I will have to just say in general, a lot of this was adaptive over the last couple of years. And we've learned a lot, and we've actually changed a lot since we've completed the project as well. The next step, there were some invasive species at the site, Phragmites, and this is Japanese sedge, which is really dense. It can create a carpet, and it really takes over all the native vegetation. So we did use a pesticide, herbicide treatment for that. It's not our first choice, but it's the only effective ways to get rid of this really tenacious sedge. So it really, even though we say 18 and 19 was our first year, it took us a couple of years to get the site prepped and ready. And so then January and February of 2019, we were finally able to get the funding in place. And I'll just point out that this is a really, even though Brooke from Rutgers and I from Conserve and Wildlife were kind of heading up the creation of it, we have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in New Jersey. We have our Army Corps of Engineers. We have New Jersey's Endangered and Non-Game Species Program, and a couple other partners on the project. And it's really been pretty cool because there's been sort of expertise coming from all those sources, and also they're sharing in the funding so far. We didn't have a large pot of money. We did not get a grant for this, and I could probably do a whole talk on the tricky way we were able to secure the funding, but I don't think that's probably the most interesting thing. But it took quite an effort to do that and secure the permit. In addition, I mentioned that when we got the permit, they were concerned about us getting rid of the maritime forest. They also, most coastal areas, including New Jersey, are not wild about you knocking down a dune. And generally, you cannot do that in our coastal zone. We thought they might give us the permit anyhow because it was going to benefit endangered species. But in the end, they did make us recreate a dune at the back of the site so that our storm protection was not diminished in this area. So it was really low tech, to be honest. Even though we had those plans I showed you, and they had contours and elevation, and we started out using them, but there was a lot of do it by ear. Brooke and I were on site almost every day or every other day for both months that first year. And we basically are taking the site back to what would be an early successional beach and dune habitat to try to mimic what it would look like after severe storm, which for piping plovers on the Atlantic coast kind of works like a firework regime works in a forest in many places. There's lots of species that when you have that burn and you renew the habitat, recolonize the site, and the same thing is largely true for piping plovers on the Atlantic coast. So just imagine this was basically, we're trying to create a storm with bulldozers, a storm effect with bulldozers. You can actually see on the top right there, there's a lot of bayberry and other shrub. You can't really see some of the, but there was cedars out there and some other trees as well that we were knocking down. This gives you a little bit of a longer view. You know, I have to admit, it was very, very exciting when the bulldozer finally got out there, and it was the dream come true, but it was also a little scary to see it all, like that beach. It still is hard to imagine knocking down a dune in the forest there, and the people stopping by were really pretty surprised too, but it's all worked out in the end. Just a little bit more, we're getting more clear there. Okay, and so now I want to give you sort of the bird's eye view. If you're really interested in the project, there is a video out there. If you just type in Barnegat Light Habitat Restoration, there's a nice 15-minute video. I suppose I could have shown it, but I thought it'd be nicer to talk about it. And so you can see the one slide that wasn't working earlier showed the site. It's about 40 to 45 acres that we have a permit to clear. We did try, it's a little hard to see, but you can see some raised oval areas. Those were the template of the original dune. We shaved all the vegetation off and lowered them, but we aren't getting rid of all the dunes. We are opening up between them so that plovers had access in and out. And then to the far right top, you can kind of see a ridge. And that's what I meant. They made us build a dune all the way around the back side. And we really were kind of horrified at first because we wanted low, flat vegetation. But I should mention, originally we were going to cart off the woody material and the Phragmites off the site. But first of all, the town wasn't too thrilled about 2 months of large construction vehicles on their roadways. And secondly, it turned out it was going to be prohibitive cost-wise. So in the end, I have to say that the permit folks did us a favor because we ended up burying all the woody vegetation that we removed and some of the frags in that dune in the back. And to mention that ultimately the cost of the project was about $500,000 or so, which may sound like a lot, but for a restoration of this size and magnitude, it really is very, very low cost. And we wouldn't have been able to do that. It would have been almost $2.5 million just because of the removal. And then we would have had to put that in landfill. And so it was in the end a win-win. It was just not something we anticipated. And when I say we learned a lot, and we get a lot of questions from our other colleagues in other parts of the range now, we've learned a lot of little things like that are kind of boring and minutia, but really important when you're doing a restoration to be thinking about costs and site removal, material removal. And yet another, one more picture. That I mentioned the video. There was a video of done of the project, and this was footage, some still photos from the video. They did have a drone that they used. Just kind of cool. You can see down the beach. You can see some of that maritime forest that's still there. So we did not actually remove all of it. You can also see further down the beaches where we had our other couple pair of plovers that weren't in our project. Okay, so one more aerial. So this is what it looked like just about a week or so before that first winter, and we had to stop. we had to stop for two reasons. One, we were out of money. And two, we have to do all the work in the winter before the plovers come back. And in fact, we also have been imposing a rule on other partners that want to do restoration work that they have to be done by March 1st, well before the plovers are going to nest, because we want the sites to have the chance to settle so they don't look like a construction site like this does. So in any case, we had a very tight deadline of when we could work. And so this is kind of what it looked like as far as the last couple week of construction. So we didn't complete it that first year. We did do one more thing after we were done. I mentioned that Dr. Maslow and I had a paper where we were talking about the vegetation density and shell cover. Our Atlantic coast plovers like shell so that they can kind of hide their nests amongst the shell bits. So we did decide we were going to place some shell back on that we purchased. And then this is our shell day, our work day, which I was not popular that day because we had to do it all by hand. We actually, this was just past our deadline when we had to have all the machinery off the beach. So we basically had it dumped, and then we got as many volunteers and staff as we could, and we spread it around. We learned a lesson that we probably didn't need to do this step in the end, because once the sand settled naturally, there was a lot of shell in that sand already. It is kind of interesting though, you can still see 3 years later, the areas we did put the sand in, and we have had some of our pairs nest right in the shell patches that we created. So, I mean, I'm not saying it was, we shouldn't have done it and it wasn't beneficial, but I have a feeling if we did it again, we wouldn't bother with this step. Okay, so one other thing I want to mention. So I mentioned a while back we were going to build the pond too. And the pond you're looking at on the photos now is not the pond we were going to build. The pond we were going to build was going to be in the section we didn't complete the first year. But when we were within the first couple of days of clearing, the top left, suddenly water started bubbling up. And I remember we had done the test wells and we knew we were close to the water table, but to be honest, we had no intention of having a pond in the location all the way out by the ocean that you see in the bottom right. And it is also our pond's gonna be much bigger. But because we knew that foraging was an important component for this project, we decided that we would kind of let it go. In fact, we dug a little bit more down and created it. Also, that meant we would have a pond our first year to sort of test if the plovers reacted to it. So in any case, I guess that's all I need to say for now. So at the end of the first year, and by the way, this looks very groomed and regular looking in the photo. When you're on the ground, it doesn't look so like a sand mine or pit, I promise you. And the vegetation did grow back. I just thought I'd throw this in. You know, we had our target species. This wasn't one of them, but our first winter of construction, this was my companion when I was out at the beach quite often. It seemed to like our survey poles in particular. So just a fun little photo to throw in there. Okay, so first year we created a lot more habitat for birds to nest, and we had our small pond. And I'm not going to tell you all the results of how the birds reacted till we get to the end, kind of the unveil. That's our little unveiling what happened in the end. But so a year later, next January and February, we had one breeding season under our belt with a partially restored site. We went back out and we started building our engineered pond and clear a little bit more habitat. And so the idea here, this is the schematic we drew. And again, We needed to have the pond deep in sections so there was always water there. But at the same time, what we're really interested in was something more along the left that was shallow and irregular, that plovers would feed along the edge and it might dry up a little and they get wet again. And it was hard to engineer that aspect of it. This is the part where we had these formal plans, but we just had the bulldozer operator work with us, and like we just kind of figured it out when we were on the site. And fortunately, we had a bulldozer operator that was really into the creative part, and really he thought this was a lot of fun. And he was used to basically sitting in the bulldozer and pushing sand or dirt. And so for him, this was his chance to be an artist, and he really took it on himself and did a great job. So here's the far out view. If you remember a few slides back, the area closest to the lighthouse had been left unfinished that first winter. And this is where our pond was going to go in second winter here. And this is just really 2 or 3 days before we're done. You can kind of see in this photo at the top part of the pond where you can barely see the bulldozers in the water pushing the sand. You can see that it's deeper there, and then that finger kind of at the bottom, that's the creative part. That's the part, in fact, we didn't even, when we built it originally, or designed it originally, it was really about mostly edge we were going to develop, but we realized we could have this idea that would mimic a foraging flat. And you can see that it's a little wet. The idea I was just talking about, you have some wet areas, some dry sand, and it's very changeable over the season. So as close as we could get to mimicking a tidal area. Just another, I wanted to show this is really interesting. So the left is what the pond flat we were just looking at and I was talking about looked like in March of 2020, right after we created it. And then the two on the right is what it looked like in July and then August. And you can see that the vegetation really filled in. You can barely see the water where we had a flat. And then on the bottom right, we have high vegetation along the pond edge. So if fortunately that was October, once the piping plovers that were using it had fledged and moved on already, but it's still problematic. And this has been our main thorn in the side with the project since we created it. The vegetation comes back almost on an annual basis. We've tried, we did a little bit of herbicide again. We have had the bulldozer back for just a day or two each winter since, so the last 2 winters, to try to deal with the vegetation. And it seems we were hoping we would create it, and we knew that maintenance would be required, but we were hoping it would be a much longer period between maintenance. I don't know why my slide moved on its own. In any case, this has been a big lesson, another lesson learned. And even though, again, we knew we had to do some maintenance, we didn't know it would have to be so frequent. I did slip in a plover foraging. That's the first winter, actually, and that was the first chick that used our pond in the lower left. So, this slide's up for a couple reasons. Mary and I were joking how she wanted to make sure I wasn't too plover centric, so they didn't think that she only had plover presentations. But I can't do a presentation without some cute photos of plovers, and it kind of fits the theme of what we're talking about here. So first of all, what happened? How successful was this or wasn't it? Even with all those challenges that we mentioned, we've had quite a bit of success. We were down to that 1 pair I told you at the inlet. We, as of last year, we had 5 breeding pairs. sounds modest, but 5 sounds modest, but that's quite an increase, and we don't think we're at capacity yet. Our productivity for our plovers has been above our recovery goal, which is 1.5 chicks per pair. We've been closer to 2 chicks per pair most years, and that's also well above the state average in the long term has only been 1 chick per pair since federal recovery. So we've done very well compared to the averages. And then one of the most exciting things that we weren't even thinking about too much when we first started was our fledgling return rate last year. So the first year after the whole thing was done was 80%, which is well above our average. And it's too early for me to tell you what the results are going to be this year. It looks like we're at least going to match 5, possibly 6 pairs. And our fledgling return rate, we're not entirely sure. Literally today, we had a fledgling from last year showed up at the site for the first time this year. It's chick. We do name our chicks. It's called Little Junior, or Uncle Junior, excuse me. And so right now it looks like we're going to have another really above average return rate for our fledglings from last year coming back to New Jersey. Lease turns. So last year we had that, I mentioned that we hadn't had them in a decade or so. First colony in Barnegat, so lease turns came back. Unfortunately, coyotes discovered the site too the last couple of years. That was one unhappy occur. It didn't occur because of the restoration. It's just coyotes were present in Cape May County to our south on the coastal environment or the beaches, and they've started moving north along the coast, and they just got to this island about a year or so before our project started. So unfortunately, yeah, the lease turns didn't do very well. And then black skimmers, we had our first colony at the inlet in 25 years and a few common terns as well. So a lot of success there. Again, the productivity wasn't great for them because of the coyote, but that's something we're gonna have to deal with one way or the other if we really wanna have colonial nesting species at the site. You know, just, so some of our plover nests in New Jersey, we used predator cages on them. I can't remember whether you use them at your site out there, but in any case, we do use them at the site so we can protect our plover nests at least. We have crow problems, we have fox problems, we have coyote problems. We have our exclosures electrified on the top in case a crow tries to land on it, and we have an electric wire around the outer edge as well if a fox or a coyote tries to approach it. So we're really up the game on the management, but so that's part of our normal management where we have sites that have those intense predators, and that includes this site. And then I want to mention our American oyster catchers. So we've only had one pair at the site for as long as we can remember, but this was really the first time, only the second time that we've ever successfully fledged chicks at the site since we started monitoring oyster catchers in New Jersey in 2003, so almost in the last 20 years. And, you know, the oyster catchers, not entirely, but they eat bivalves, that's their main food source. They go to that jetty and pull off mussels. So you could argue that our restoration did not help them, but it probably did. Based on the area that they took the chicks, it didn't exist prior to the restoration, and it gave them some cover and more room to move around and evade predators. So we do actually think it was part of this success story. And I can tell you, we had a second pair prospecting last year, and that pair did return this year and has nested. So we actually have increased the number of American oyster catchers too, at least doubled it. Again, only 2 pairs, but one at a time. Recovery happens 1 pair at a time, as you and the Great Lakes know even better than us as far as plovers go. Every single pair counts a lot, especially for the Great Lakes piping plovers, and that's the same for us and our oyster catchers as well. So, yes, one of the questions would be, what's next? So among other things, we know that we're going to keep tweaking both the maintenance and some aspects. When we had the bulldozer out to get rid of the vegetation this past winter, we experimented with cutting some holes in the dunes that we didn't get rid of all the dunes. We created some cutouts on the ocean front, which we didn't have before, so that we could get some periodic natural tidal flow to scour the vegetation on its own, so we didn't have to bring out a bulldozer. Unfortunately, we've had 2 major nor'easters in this April, and just interestingly, yeah, we wanted to open it up so that we'd get some storm surge, but I'm not sure that we wanted that to happen in April and May during breeding season. Fortunately, it kind of worked the way we hoped. Our plover nesting has been very late this year because we've had very cool weather. So when we had those storms, we did not have many nests yet. So we didn't really lose a lot. And it did actually scour the vegetation and create more optimal habitat for us in the short term. So that's one thing we're going to keep tweaking as we can, and as long as we can get some funding to do that. And then secondly, that area in the circle, which is just to the south of the pond. The pond in this aerial doesn't show up, but that pond you see in upper left is kind of in that area. And we'd like to finish up the last bit of the red line is what we have a permit to clear, and we didn't clear that area in the circle, again, for funding reasons. But we're hoping to try to get some funding and basically finish the area. As we get 5 to 6 pairs there, we think we can get about up to 8. But if we clear that area, we might be able to get more. So we're dealing with the capacity issues. And that's a good problem to have, that we are starting to see that, we have almost as many plovers as probably will fit in an area of this size. So that's our next dream. And I guess I can retire when that happens. I don't know when that's going to be, when we're going to construct this, but we're hoping possibly by early as next year. So I think that's it. I was aiming for about 45 minutes. It looks like I hit it. So I don't know how you want to do this, Mary and Sue, whether you want to, are you going to ask me questions, or is the person going to ask me? And I have one question for Mary too, when we're done with any questions that the participants have.
Well, there's only one question so far in the chat. Okay. And that's a request for the video link for the 15-minute video for the habitat restoration. And I'm sure someone could go find it and post it here if they could. I unfortunately cannot right now. I do have a question. Sure. I actually have several. Just because I'm totally engaged. Or the Plover ponds, the pond that you created, freshwater or saltwater?
Mostly salt. I mean, they're kind of a brackish. They ended up being brackish, but they do get some flow from the front of the ocean. So the small one in the front definitely gets overwashed now. And so that's, largely turned salt. And then the big one in the back, the groundwater has, is very high salinity. So it does, but it dries up partially and then it's rain. So it's kind of a mix. I don't know. Does that answer your question basically?
Well, yeah, I'm just curious because, I mean, we have naturally occurring ponds at Gull Point, and they ebb and flow. We don't have tides, but, yeah, with precipitation and wind direction, the ponds fill up or recede. And I was just curious, I mean, because you did well surveys, and I didn't know if the wells were freshwater, and you said water was bubbling up. So I was wondering if it was freshwater or salt
Yeah, it
water.
was largely fresh when it initially came into the pond, but over time it's pretty much salt. It's fairly salty at this point because of the
Okay.
ocean water coming in. I did forget a really important thing I should have mentioned, if you don't mind. Barnegat Light is one of the most visited spots in all of the New Jersey coast, and people go to the lighthouse in the back of the picture that I scrolled back, and they walk along the jetty all the way out to the ocean. So prior to the ponds being built, the plovers that were here would go, the jetty has pools along it that are tidal, that seeps under the jetty, and that's where the plovers were feeding primarily. But there was a steady line of people and dogs walking along there, and so they were constantly disturbed. They would go out and have to run back. So the area where the restoration is now, and even before, was fenced with symbolic, what we call, post string signs to keep people out. But obviously it didn't keep plovers from going out once they had chicks to feed. And that was really their only option. So I should have mentioned the whole, it's one of the most important aspects. The whole idea here was to build these ponds within the area that was already closed to the public. So in a theory, the plovers never had to leave. They could nest there, they could feed there, they could grow up so they could fly there. And I should tell you, amazingly, the first full year after, we had 3 pairs at the site, and that's what happened. The chicks never fed outside the area until they reached their fledge date. Last year, when we had 5 pairs, it was a little too tight, and they fought over those pond space. And so we did have 1 or 2 of the pairs would start to move out of the areas. But again, this is a good problem to have. It means we're reaching our capacity, but they still were very successful, and they used the ponds, but they also used the older foraging habitat. So in any case, sorry, long-winded, but so important, and I can't believe I missed mentioning that part.
No, that's okay. And this is kind of related. Someone said, to what extent is this restored area used by humans, which I think you've already answered.
Yep.
But what are the protections for the birds? I assume that this is closed to the public.
So yes, so New Jersey, one of our tricks, so I should mention in New Jersey, our hatch rates for piping plover nests is pretty high. It's comparable to anywhere on the Atlantic coast. Our fledgling rates are some of the worst. Our productivity, the number of chicks fledged per pair, is some of the worst along the Atlantic coast. And to a large degree, it's because their beaches are so busy. We're not the only busy beach. New York and other places have busy beaches too. However, our foraging opportunities are poor, and their only option is basically to, in most cases in New Jersey, with 1 or 2 minor or major exceptions in one case, but is to go to the shoreline where all the people are. So we have what's called our public trust doctrine in New Jersey, means we have to keep shoreline access open to people. We can close the area where they nest, and we can do some limited closures of the foraging area, but not entire ones. So from that lighthouse all the way along the jetty to where the ocean front is, we have to keep access. And so there's a steady stream of people walking there. And if our plovers are trying to get out there to feed, they would constantly be disturbed. So that's a little bit of our Achilles heel. Just quickly, we have 2 national wildlife refuge sites that are really important and now have the most plovers in the state. And those are closed entirely to the public. But generally, it has to be a share the shore type of arrangement at our New Jersey nesting sites.
Well, I have a question about that sharing the shore. How does New Jersey's regulations compare to other states up and down the Atlantic coast?
In what way, though, more specifically, do you mean by that?
Do other states make their beaches more restrictive to people in order, or not necessarily?
It really varies. And then there's a lot of, on the Atlantic coast, there are a lot of sites that allow private ownership of the coastal zone. And so that's even trickier. One of my close colleagues on Martha's Vineyard, for instance, her organization, they work on some of the public beaches, but they primarily work with the private landowners, trying to come to a compromise where the private landowners will, allow space for the plovers and their personal use of the beach. So it really varies a lot. In New Jersey, it happens that there's not a lot of private ownership. It's mostly the municipal or state entity that owns the beach, but that public trust doctrine is very powerful. I mean, our Endangered Species Acts, the federal and the state one in New Jersey, are pretty strong too. And it's just, this is one area where the two bump into one another. It's a gray area. And I know, all those legal things can be boring, but it's just a, tug of war. We've been fortunate that there hasn't been a lawsuit about it, but generally speaking, it's a compromise situation for us to try to balance the two. I'm sorry, yeah, I don't know all the I don't know all the other states on the Atlantic coast, but I know a lot of them require public access as well. I know ours tends to be the more liberal for public access, allows a lot of public access in theory. So, hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did. And I have another question. I am always interested in plants. And when you are mentioning having to get a bulldozer out or have the storms wash away plants, are those native plants that are reestablishing or the invasives?
So it's a combination of both. The Phragmites is very tenacious. So that's coming back because the root mass is really still present there. It's just buried. And so that's one we're going to have to battle. But, most of it's been native species, but I have to admit, so the jetty, the whole purpose of the jetty is to make the inlet stabilize it. And so what happens, and the reason it went from a bare sand in 2 decades to almost entirely vegetated, is it's stable. It is not getting storm overwashed, generally speaking. Where there's a jetty, they don't want that. So even the native vegetation becomes a problem for us in these. Again, remember, we're going for early successional, not late successional. So we are actually, with the bulldozer in this particular case, because it's focused specifically on our endangered beach nesting birds, we are removing native grasses from the site in our maintenance period as well, to some degree. Finding the happy medium's been a little bit of the trick. So we want to get rid of some, but not too much. It just goes against, I think for me too, I mean, it goes against everything we've been taught about dune grass, and, you want to treat it carefully and never, damage it. But this is a whole different purpose here. Any other questions?
Well, someone asked, could the coyote and other large predators be captured and moved inland away from the beach area?
Yes and no. In theory, they could, but 2 things. In New Jersey, we're not allowed to transport captured wildlife. So the only option would be to remove it legally. So that would be our only option. We've chosen not to at this site. There's also some study. So really interesting. And Dr. Maslow, I mentioned a couple times, is currently doing a couple studies. She has radio collars on fox, including at this site, but really the whole coast of New Jersey, and some camera studies focusing on predators. Because there's been a lot of, there's no shortage of studies of fox and mammals, but not necessarily on a beach and coastal environment. And so one thing is, prior to the coyotes being at this site, we had a lot of red fox. They were the main problem. We have no red fox at the site now because generally speaking, not entirely, I'm oversimplifying, but coyotes and red fox in the coastal environment do not coexist. The coyote is the new apex predator. So for now, we're choosing to deal with see how the coyote is impacting it. And there's a lot of studies that suggest if you remove, it's a whole family of coyotes, and if we remove one and we don't remove the right one, it actually causes the whole more, I don't know what the right word is here, I apologize, but the whole family structure, not so unlike when with wolves, it just creates a whole different unpredictable circumstance there. And so right now there is modest amount of coexisting with the coyote and at least the plovers, not those colonial nesters. So until Dr. Maslow finishes her study here, we're trying to eke it out and put it on a hold so we can see. Pretty much where coyotes have been removed, either another one moves back in eventually or very shortly, or the other predators fill the vacuum. So it's just something we want to study a little bit more.
Okay, I've got another question. Do you have aerial predators?
Yes. So for our avian predators at this site are primarily crows. I mentioned that we put electric wire over electric on the top of our predator cages.
And how do you electrify those? I'm fascinated.
Yeah, well, we have a little MacGyver guy on our staff that does some of it, but there's actually some literature out there. For the ground mammals, it's a wire that encircles the exclosure that's about 10 to 12 inches off the ground. So it's just high enough that a plover would walk under it back in, because as you know, our plovers walk back into the nest and the cage. So, but it's low enough that if a mammal, fox or coyote approaches it, it'll get that little shock to at least deter it. The wiring, it's a kind of the wiring on the top's a little trickier, and I don't know all the technicalities to explain to you, but other people are using it. I think we use it a little more than other states on the Atlantic coast, and we don't use it everywhere. It's a lot of work and effort, and you got to check them. They were battery operated. We now have gone to solar operated. But Sandy Hook National Park Service, which was for many years our most important site in New Jersey, was using the electric on just about every one of their plover nests at one time.
I didn't realize that you guys exclosed the nests.
Yeah, and we don't in all our locations. There are certain ones we do and certain we don't. Oh, and to jump back, so crows, and the issue with crows is they couldn't get in the cages, of course, because there's netting on top, but they were smart enough to realize that chicks were going to walk out of the cage eventually. So they would basically come back every day and wait until chicks were getting ready to leave the predator cage and grab them as soon as they left. So that basically was tipping them off. So that's why we had to go to the electric in that case. Our other avian predators are gulls, various gull species, herring, great blackback, and laughing gulls. And then for the adults, potentially peregrine falcon and great horned owl. And they're the ones that we have to think twice about if we have on site, whether we're going to use the cages, because they key in on the birds when they're leaving the cages and grab them, the adults. And so long story short, there's a lot of literature and also even a predictive model we can use, tell us whether percentage-wise it would be better to use the cage, the predator cage or not. And we use it as a kind of a rough consultation. So we get pretty sophisticated with the deciding whether we're going to use the predator cage or not. But generally, if we have owls or peregrine falcons at a site, we don't even consider it.
Okay. Do you receive reports of your plovers in southern wintering sites?
Oh, yes. And fortunately, I'm one of the ones that gets to go to see some of them. So like many of the Atlantic coast plovers, the Bahamas, most of the largest percentage of them are in the Bahamas, and then a smaller number on the Southeast US, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida, including the Gulf Coast. But most of our re-sightings are coming back from the Bahamas. I think at least one was in Cuba and maybe Turks and Caicos, but the surveys aren't as frequent in the winter there. That answer that question, or just somebody, was that your question, Mary, or someone in the chat?
It was not my question. It was someone else's. Carolyn, if you are not happy with, or if
yeah, if you don't like my answer, I will come up with another one. No, if I didn't answer it in depth enough, if I didn't get to the point you were, just throw something in the chat. Maybe in the meantime, I do have a question for Mary. I thought I remember hearing that your plover site there, did it also have some sort of restoration that was done at that site going back in time? Or am I getting you mixed up with another place?
No. Well, actually, our habitat is sort of continually being managed.
Right.
The Western Pennsylvania Conservancy is part of our piping plover common tern recovery team, and they do assessments every year, and management of woody and invasive species happens on an annual basis, typically in the fall, after the plovers have left. And yes, they do use herbicide. And we have Phragmites, and we do have some natives that have to be controlled to maintain Gull Point as a palestrin sand plain without tall vegetation.
Okay. So it's really, I mean, your site is really, I mean, you're doing all the same things as it turns out. It's just, you know, different scale, there's just nuances a little different. I mean,
right.
We had to bring it back to zero basically here.
Right. Well, as somebody who's birded Gull Point, and for a number of years before I became involved in the plover recovery, Gull Point is far more flat and open than it used to be.
Right.
Yeah, there was a lot of vegetation coming up on Gull Point, and it was it's a recurve sand spit, and so
Right.
New areas are always being formed, but the vegetation was working faster than the natural accretion of sand.
And that's really, yeah, exactly. And that's, just this area, all the photos I've been showing you, except for that one slide, it's all like, looks like nice, open, clean sand, but we just were shocked how fast even the non-invasive species came back. And so, yep, we know now that we're in it for the long term, like you, if we want to maintain it in optimal conditions. And
right.
I would say that unfortunately, you're lucky that you have a partner that sees that, I guess, because here in New Jersey, a lot of, we did build in a maintenance, but again, not as frequently initially as we anticipated. But a lot of the restorations that happened in New Jersey prior for plovers, that was the Achilles heel. They built it, the birds came, and then everybody walked away. There was no ongoing maintenance. And so that's really the most important lesson, I think,
right.
Because you have a big investment, and it just doesn't take long for the tide to turn. I think in the Great Lakes, I mean, I'm not an expert on the Great Lakes plovers, but in some ways, it's not so different than New Jersey in that we're saying we lack suitable habitat. It seems in the Great Lakes now, you have, you've reached a point where you're producing a fair amount of chicks each year. But aside from sleeping bear dunes in Michigan, there's not as many suitable sites left sprinkled around. So that's.
Yeah, well, one of the places in Ohio, and the name of it's besides Maumee Bay, which is where Nellie and Nish nested last year, a place farther east, they actually closed a part of their habitat specifically to attract piping plovers. And
Right.
it looks like good habitat from what I've seen. And it's just kind of a wait and see sort of thing, like
Right.
it was here.
Right.
And Pennsylvania has a really, Gull Point is it. That's our entire habitat.
Right.
For piping plovers and common terns in the state. There's no other habitat within the state that supports those two species.
Right.
So it's heavily managed, primarily because and like last year they did work, but it seems like some of the herbicide applications really didn't take.
Right.
And we had last summer we had kind of what we called the forest of small saplings and higher vegetation, and they tried treating that last fall, and it was everybody thought they did a thorough job, but apparently, we still have a problem. So it's
Right.
ongoing. But and no one's to blame. I'm not pointing a finger at anybody, because it is a team. We have Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, we have Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, we have the Game Commission, and various other groups, Army Corps of Engineers, just like you. And it takes a village,
Right.
the typical thing. There is one question: do birds from other sites appear at your site? Just curious about the range of your birds and other plover visitors. That was from someone else.
When I was wondering if the person could say, what do you mean by appear? I'm not quite understanding the question, I guess.
This is Carolyn. I'm just interested in the travels that your birds do, or do other birds come there? Just curious about the birds, you've given a very complete view of the work that you've done to create habitat. I'm just wondering if that's typical that some other birds show up too.
Oh, do you mean other species of birds entirely, like outside of beach nesting birds, or just other beach nesting birds?
I guess other beach nesting birds, since plovers are the main topic of conversation.
Yeah. Well, two things I want to say. I was kind of answering my own question. We do have a lot of other birds at the site that use that pond, by the way, that it's interesting when some of the people that were kind of against the project in the beginning, because it seemed plover centric, and by the way, it's really for all the other beach nesting birds, but it is called Plover Park is the local name that's catching on. But what I wanted to say is we've had a lot of interesting species use the site, which is really exciting. As far as other birds there, as far as other plovers coming, at least during the breeding season, our birds are so territorial that we don't really the only birds we get there are basically our breeders. By the way, I just put in the chat. I think I put in the chat the YouTube. I hope that's the right one.
It looks good.
Yeah, that's it. So that's, if anyone's interested in the video, that's the link. Took me a while to figure out how to do that, but I got it.
I'm curious, Todd, this is just a related question to Carolyn's. Do you get American pipits there?
Have not, no, we don't. Not, no.
Okay. Okay, because we get migrators, we get migrants. Yeah. And I call them beach robins.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I was just curious because I was looking at a range map and it looks like you may get them in the winter.
Yeah, not too, I don't think we get them too frequently.
Okay, all right. Just that was just a
Yeah.
off the cuff.
Okay, anything else? So one thing that's interesting is, about other birds, we do get, sometimes in the fall, we get plovers show up at this, have showed up the site or nearby, and we don't know this for sure, but we're pretty sure that some plovers on the Atlantic coast do their prospecting for the next year, kind of after the breeding season or late in the breeding season. So we actually have been continuing our plover surveys well past the point when the birds fledge, just to see who stays around. But just in general, at least in New Jersey, we thought most of our plovers left in, pretty much by August, maybe a few lingers, but we've now had, with the surveys we do, we know there's some sites that are important staging, or they just hang around longer. Well into October. We've been doing surveys all the way, weekly surveys all the way through October now for our plovers, and we still have some in New Jersey. That's about the limit, unless you have a weird outlier. Somebody said, "Thank you for your wonderful presentation." Thank you, Charles, it looks like, but he has to get up early in the morning, so can't blame him.
So do I.
Yeah. Okay.
I do have one more question.
Sure.
I'm curious. You banned at your site.
Okay.
Not all Atlantic sites banned, correct?
Correct. I did show a picture of a banded chick. That's one of the fledglings from last year. So unlike the Great Lakes, we do not ban all our plovers or most of our plovers on the Atlantic coast. We had some injury issues going back in time. They seem to be resolved, but our range-wide recovery leader at the federal level pretty much has a pretty strong rule that, if you're going to disturb the birds and do all that, it has to be for a really good reason, whether it be a research issue that we need studied or something that's going to help recovery or management. So it's a pretty high bar. So there's now more banding that was going on, say 20 years ago, when it was pretty much shut down on the Atlantic coast. We started banning in New Jersey through State University of New York, ESF. For a few studies, there was a study about wind turbine impacts on piping plovers, a few other studies that we participated in. So that's the only reason we banned it. We have stopped banding again because we don't have an ongoing research project. By the time we stopped, it's the last 2 or 3 years we haven't been banding. But the one but is we were able to continue, not me personally, but the State's Endangered Species Program, which is one of our partners on the project, is banning all the birds at the site so that we can kind of study. So when I say we have 50% recovery rate, we only know that because we have banded all the chicks and all but one of the adults so far. But this is the last spot currently in New Jersey we're doing any banding. We have some study questions that we hope we can get back to banding our population. But anyhow, I think that answers your question, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I just know that, some Atlantic coast birds get banded and others don't. And I wasn't clear what the criteria is. Of course, there's some Great Lakes piping plovers that are running around unbanded as well. Primarily because the nests have never been detected And I like to think that there's like more nests out there that are producing chicks that we don't know about. I know that last year at our site, we had a chick that eluded banding,
Right.
and he didn't get banded, or she didn't get banded. And it would be awesome to know the future of that bird, and
Right.
I also know that there's been some interbreeding between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic. But it's from at least for me, I'm not in scientific circles. I don't hear, the details of that. But
Right.
I know that some Great Lakes birds have shown up on the Atlantic coast and have mated with Atlantic birds. And I think that's a great thing for the populations in general, because it's strengthening the genetics.
Right. My understanding is that it's a really, really small percentage though. So more
Yeah.
incidental than of any. So there's not a lot of it, but there is some, you're right. So it's interesting. And it'll also be more interesting. So the Great Lakes birds that are plovers that are on in New York State, they actually have been seen in New Jersey on the flyway in the fall and spring now. So they're the closest, I guess. You're the next closest as far as Great Lakes birds to New Jersly, but it's just kind of interesting that they're
Ontario.
yeah, they're using our flyway for sure. They're flying along New Jersey. We've always seen one or two Great Lakes birds over the years, but in migration, but it's very small. We had one of Vince's Sleeping Bear Dunes birds this spring used New Jersey for a couple days.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I saw Great Lakes birds in the Bahamas when I was there.
Yes, and I saw a couple, but just 1, 2, 3 in a decade and many surveys. So, but still, when you consider 3 with your small population, it's not, that something. So, and that was just one island. So,
Right. Yeah. Well, we had 2 at Ambergris, and we had one of the 2 birds of those 2 birds later
Right.
on at another island. So yeah, it's, they get around.
Right. Yes, as a matter of fact, just on a little celebrity connection, and I know it's sad that Monty and apparently Rose is no longer with us either, likely. The bird I saw in the Bahamas was Rose's mom, basically.
Ah, okay.
That's my connection to the Monty and Rose story. So.
Yeah. Well, we have the Nellie and Nish contribution, because we contributed Nellie.
That's right. Very exciting. So
yeah, but and everybody that's still on this call is going, what are they talking about?
Yes, we're getting in the weeds on Plover. See, you're breaking your own rule, Mary. We're being Plover centric.
Yes.
I have a question. How will we
Sure.
be able to find out what is going on with your site in the future?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We don't, it's hard, we don't have for those site specific, we don't just decided I wanted to get out. I didn't realize I locked my cat in the room the whole time. So
damn cats.
Yeah. So long and short, we don't do a report specifically for the restoration. We plan on eventually, Dr. Maslow and I doing some kind of, I don't know if it won't be necessarily a science paper, somewhere in the middle between science and, a blog, but we don't, the state publishes the results of all their sites that it's included in, but that's it, all I have. So I don't have a really good answer for you.